Hello, welcome to Let's Talk Black Education with Margaret Fortune. I am Dr. Margaret Fortune, your host. This is a show where we talk education and uplift the voices of Black women. I want to go ahead and start by meeting our guests for today. Today we have with us Dr. Cynthia Glover Woods, who is a member of the California State Board of Education. She is the retired Chief Academic Officer of the Riverside County Office of Education. The State Board of Education is the board that implements the policy that is in the California Education Code passed by our legislators and signed by our governor. And Dr. Glover Woods sits on that board. I'd also like to have you join me in welcoming Trustee Pam Haynes, who's the president of the California Community Colleges Board of Governors. Miriam Raccah joins us from New York City, where she is the executive director of the Bronx Charter School for the Arts. She's also a part of a coalition that supported Eric Adams as the next mayor of New York City. Welcome to my guests and welcome to this conversation. What I'm really interested in today is talking about Black in school. In California, for a long time, over 20 years, we've had policy that says that you cannot focus public policy on Black people in particular. This proposition that was passed by California voters at the urging of Ward Connerly, at that time, UC Regent, and he's an African-American man, not only affects Blacks in education, but in every walk of life. But the results in education have been particularly devastating to Black children, and I'll get to that in a moment. Recently, Californians reaffirmed the fact that we want that proposition in place when voters took to the polls and refused to revoke the policy after these many years and after seeing the results on Black people in California. So California is a place where you can't do in law anything in particular for Black people, and that applies to Black children as well. So let's explore some of the data that shares with us what the results are for Black kids, and I'm going to be interested to get the feedback of my guests on how this strikes you. So 67% of Black kids in California don't read or write at grade level. 79% of Black kids in California aren't at grade level in math. 86% of Black kids in California aren't at grade level in science. And when it comes to public school funding, there are 80,000 Black students who don't qualify for supplemental school funding because they're not low income, English learners, or foster youth. And if you add that up, when you consider each of these children, if they did belong to those groups, would generate $6,000 a piece for the schools that serve them. That adds up to a $560 million funding gap for California's Black students. So let me turn first to Dr. Glover Woods as a member of the State Board of Education and ask you, how does that data hit you?
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Fortune. And the data hits me as it has historically, which is very concerning, very, very concerning, because we do know that our Black students are able to achieve at just as high levels as their peers, to be very honest. So it is very concerning. And I think one of the pieces that we have started doing in California and must continue to do is to have a dialogue about not only the why, but the things that we need to do to be sure that these numbers flip in the opposite direction, where we do have those extreme large percentages of students that are reading on grade level, are achieving math proficiency, are proficient in science.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Trustee Haynes. You are coming from the vantage point of the community colleges and have been a real leader in the area of promoting Black student achievement. How does this data strike you?
It's alarming, and it's been alarming for a while. And for me, I've made a choice that when I start to speak about achievement and where we need to go as a community college system, and let me sort of put some numbers around California's community college system. We serve close to 2 million students in 58 counties. We accept the top 100%, and that includes African American students. Um, and so the challenge for us is we've got to be intentional. We've got to see the urgency of what we need to do, and then we've got to address the challenges and the opportunities that our students have on our system. And for many years, there has been the acceptance of being colorblind, and it has worked to our disadvantage. I think we do need to start to speak about race and those implications for our students, and begin to develop not just programs, but a recognition of what is needed in the classroom, cultural competency relative to our faculty, and then really wrapping around services that our students need in order to be successful. And we and our students need touch points. We have got to reach out to them and not expect and change our institutions and not and meet our students where they are, not have them come into our institutions and say, okay, you're here, figure it all out.
You know, it's an interesting thing, Trustee Haynes. You talk about, California having this, quote unquote, colorblind policy, and it's so useful to have a perspective from elsewhere. And I'm curious, Miriam, if it's like this in New York. In New York, can you have specific public policy about Black students?
So there are none that I can find. So I don't think it's illegal, that it's against the law, as it were, but all of the policies that I see in place and I'm aware of are really focused on students with disabilities, low-income students, English language learners, and the like, and very few sort of in the public sphere are focused specifically on minority students. An interesting place that they are making some noise has been in terms of our testing schools. So Stuyvesant is the most popular one, where kids have to take a test in 8th grade in order to enter what is a really rigorous high school. And the current mayor, de Blasio, has been working to try and make that system more equitable. So we talk a lot about equity in New York, but never specifically for Black or Latin students. So in that way, and I will say proficiency is almost identical for Black students in New York as it is in California. So whether or not it's a question of what's legal, the practical implications are identical.
So this issue of the Black achievement gap is a national issue. It's a generational issue. In New York City, education has been, a divisive issue. But it's interesting that I've seen some alignment around the support of Eric Adams as the next mayor. Can you speak to that? Is there a shift in terms of educators coming in support behind a mayor? Is there some unity? Is that how we should read the tea leaves from across the country?
I'm hopeful. Certainly, as you mentioned, I'm one of the founders of the Black, Latinx, Asian Charter Collaborative, and we have been very specifically supportive of Mayor-elect Eric Adams. We're very excited about what we hope and think he will do for education in New York City. He's very focused on making sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our students, and equity is very much front of mind for him and who he sort of is as a person. He's also, we're looking at who he names as his chancellor and what that message sends as well. He's very focused on, just as Trustee Haynes said, so, wrapping around services for kids so that students don't fall through the cracks, and that we are meeting them where they are. And one of the things that I particularly appreciate about Eric Adams is his narrative. He always leads with the stories of who he is and where he comes from. And as somebody who struggled with dyslexia in his education, it's an amazing thing for a Black man to stand in front of the city and speak to Black students and educators, frankly, and say that, as a Black man who had learning issues, this was hard for me, and yet I have achieved everything that I've achieved, and so let's make it easier for the next kids coming along.
That's powerful. Dr. Glover Woods, I'm wondering, what is the climate at the State Board of Education in California when you talk about issues of Black student achievement? So many of us serve in capacities where we're, one of few Blacks on a board or in a room. And I'm wondering how those conversations feel for you as a leader and as a Black woman, and what are the conversations that are happening on that policy board? It's such an important influencer in California.
Well, I will say, serving on the California State Board of Education has definitely added an additional layer of understanding in my career over 30 years as an educator. One thing I am very thankful for is that there are very like-minded people on the board that really do have the best interest of California children in mind, inclusive of our Black children. Some of the very key things, and I'm going to kind of go back to something that Trustee Haynes said about being intentional. Dr. Fortune, you mentioned how to be able to specifically call out Black students is not something that can be done in California as it relates to legislation and whatnot. However, where we can really focus and where the conversations have been taking place at the state board is around those key practices that we know will be very beneficial. Another point that I want to kind of bring up before I talk about some specifics is the fact that it's very important, and I believe we do this not only in California, but across the country. It's very important to recognize that our Black students as a group, as a student group, are very heterogeneous in nature. And speaking to the number of thousands of students that don't generate funding underscores that. We have students from various income levels, various family structures, as well as a myriad of interests and varied interests. So when we look at what specifically and intentionally should be done to support Black students from pre-K on, we have to keep those things in mind. A couple of conversations that have been we've been having about, a couple of conversations we've had as of late, very currently, has been around diversifying that teacher pipeline. And as some may be aware, there's been a significant amount of dollars in California allocated to educator preparedness. But we have to really look at how do we get more Black educators in the pipeline as teachers and administrators and the like, and focusing on the recruitment and retention side of it, as well as the interest in those who are in college to go into the field of education as Black college students. One other aspect I'd like to just kind of touch base on is ensuring that the curriculum and the pedagogy as such that it affirms and celebrates the Black culture, as well as ensures that our Black students feel valued, welcomed, and respected when they're on the campuses. So really looking at very specifics when it comes to the implementation of our different subject areas, inclusive of reading and math, is very, very key. So I'll stop there, but I would probably just underscore and say we must be very intentional in those practices we know serve Black students well, and that is where our conversation as a state board have been really aligning to.
Miriam, I know that you were ran the Urban Teacher Corps for 5 years that had a mission of getting more Black teachers in the classroom. And I run a teacher ed program, that's 25 years old. So this that my father started when he was a superintendent. So this idea of diversifying the classroom has been one that we've worked towards for a long time. But I'd like you to speak to that. And then Pam, I've got a special question for you. Miriam?
Yeah, I think it's so critical, and there have been countless studies that have shown that when a student has a Black teacher, they have higher achievement. And so based on that, in 2010, I think it was, a colleague and I started Urban Teaching Corps, and it was an apprenticeship program. So we had to find schools that would allow our teachers to go in and teach alongside an experienced teacher, and we had a coach that went in and coached them along until they got certified and were able to be a lead teacher. It was really a wonderful program. The challenge we had was funding it, because it was expensive, right? Because we had to pay for the school had to pay their salaries, but they weren't the teacher of record, and we had this coaching formula that was also rather expensive. But it was some of the best work, I think, in some ways that I've done. And most of the students, it was a very small group because we only did it for 5 years, but most of them are still teaching, which I think is the other thing that we find with teachers of color, is that they will stay in teaching. It's not something that they use as a stepping stone. It's much more a calling. And we certainly found that as well.
That really resonates. And I've started to call people by their first names now. I always like to respect. We earn the titles. You will use them. We were elected to the offices. You will acknowledge. And now I need to acknowledge that we're friends.
There you go. Okay, Margaret.
So, we're friends in the work, right? So Pam, you come from this rich political background, having worked for speakers of the California Assembly and such. It seems to me that Latino lawmakers have been very effective at getting a whole body of legislation and programs installed in the education code so that English learners, which is a population that they advocate for, are taken care of. Whether it's the teacher ed programs that we've just been speaking about, or it's teacher credentialing requirements that say that every licensed teacher in the state of California has to know how to teach an English learner, or if it's being included in school funding formulas, generating $6,000 per student for schools that serve English learners, or if it's saying that if you have a certain amount of English learners in your school, you must have an advisory committee of the parents of English learners. There's a whole body of policy that is about teaching this specific group of students. And I wonder what you read in the political tea leaves for Black leaders about their ability to create that whole body of legislation for Black kids.
So can we talk some real talk here? And part of that political power is the result of just the number of Latino residents in California, which is, if my numbers are correct, my percentages at least, about 38% of California's population, and growing. While the Black population, while the numbers are big when one looks outside of the state, the percentage is somewhere around 5 to 6%, and so that's some of the reality that we have to deal with. But as you were sort of laying this out, African American students are the canaries in the coal mine.
Mm.
And we have to see it as that, and we have to call it as that. And let me also say that there is leadership, at least at the political level, relative to our African American representatives, and there are coalitions that are being built. And so my experience has been that in many cases we've gone arm in arm. And so when we start to talk about folks of color, that conversation is about Black and Latino students, because when you look at the data, and I want to sort of piggyback on what some of my colleagues have just said. When you look, if you were to look at the data, those students that are Latino and Black are not attaining what they need to attain. And so, when asked the question, sort of how do you bring the issues forward, data really informs, and then you can't walk away from data. You can sometimes shade it over, but you cannot walk away from data in a way that you can make actionable decisions that are critical to the success of our students. I and that's where the rubber meets the road. There was also a mention of diversity, and that has risen to one of the top issues. 71% of California's community colleges, and I mentioned that we are close to somewhere around 2 million, maybe a little bit less as a result of the pandemic and the economy. But 72% of our community college going students and adult learners are of color. That's big. And we have become and I hate to use a majority minority. We are an emerging majority in the state of California, and we really do need to sort of recognize that piece. And when we look at our faculty, what we see relative to that 71% of who actually attends our schools is that about 60 to 62% are faculty that don't look like our students. They are, for the most part, white faculty, and that's not to denigrate that piece of it, but we really do need to diversify our faculty, because and to provide the cultural competency relative to curriculum, to make it relevant for those who are attending. There's a whole series of things that we have to do, both in the classroom and on our campuses, that changes the environment for our students, in particular our African American students, because they do not feel like they belong. And so a lot of work has to be intentional around how do we do that, both on campus, but even more importantly, in the classroom, to make certain that they are getting the support that they need relative to the success that we know that they can achieve if the circumstances and the environment around them is one that they can thrive.
There are such powerful nuggets in what you've said, and I also want to make the observation that a lot of times in these conversations where Blacks enter in as a part of a coalition of people of color, because there are legal barriers to Black kids being served in particular, our kids don't get served. So I do think that there's an importance, and Cynthia has said this, of naming Black kids in particular. I'm going to advocate for Black kids in particular, and the canary in the coal mine analogy suggests that as go Black kids, go the rest of the kids in the system, and I think that there other kids have benefited from the system in a way that Black kids have not. So, Tony Thurman, who is our superintendent of public instruction, the second African-American to be in that post, the first was Wilson Riles in the 1970s, has named a task force for Black student achievement. And we've seen many task force come and go. But what he is doing, and I applaud him for it, is saying, I'm for all students. And today we're going to talk about Black students. Or as our pastors like to say, on today, we're going to talk about about Black students. So, as we hold these positions that we do, Cynthia, how do you use your post as a state board member to say, today we're talking about Black kids, regardless of what the law says? How do you use your position as a bully pulpit for that purpose?
Mm-hmm. And again, a very good question. I think I'll have to go back to a phrase that has become very, people just bat it around now, which is equity. Years back, we talked about equity, and it really meant equity, making sure every student has what they need. Now it's just become yet another catchphrase in education. So when we talk about supporting and serving Black students in particular, that's under that umbrella of equity. Because if equity is giving every student what they need, what you have to do is look at each particular type of student group, look at the data, and Trustee Haynes spoke to this a bit. You've got to look at the data to know what it is. And I'm also going to say that you must disaggregate that data so that you can get an even better picture of what the trends are, where the issues are, and what the local needs are. And then you can have those very specific conversations. Specific to Black students, it's about using that lens when it comes to curricular resources, when it comes to, we were talking about the educator pipeline, if you will, and making sure that in our pre-service programs, our induction programs, all of those different areas that we're able to infuse and integrate information that helps educators, again, celebrate and affirm the Black culture and know how to serve students, Black students in particular, as well as the diverse needs of all of the other student groups in our state.
So I want to put some numbers to of what Pam talked about that are affirming of her point, that Black students represent 5% of California's 6 million students. So there are just over 300,000 Black students in the public school system. That's how big the bread box is. Miriam, you run a public charter school, and you have founded schools. Your emphasis is in the arts, but you also are a national advocate for the education of Black students. How do you use your positionality in this conversation to advocate for the rights of Black students and the educational rights of Black students?
Well, we are, 98%, 99% of our student body are Black and brown students. And so I think as a school leader, what I can do is just exactly what Dr. Oh my goodness, Cynthia, just because I can't remember all the words, all the names, what she just mentioned in terms of celebrating and affirming Black and brown students, and specifically Black students, right? So there's a power in having the executive director of this organization be a Black woman. There's a power in the fact that we have the vast majority of our teachers are Black and brown folk that come from the community. There's a power in our saying that, we're going to espouse this thing called the Just Academy, which we're actually in development on, which is really comes from urban planning, and it looks at different indicators through which a community can be viewed, and we're applying it to a school. So things like, what does equity look like in your community? What does access look like in your community? So what does it look like in your school? And just having those conversations and making sure that teachers have a familiarity and a comfort with those conversations goes a long way to making sure that kids feel like this is a place for them, right? That their success is what we're all about, and that their safety and their well-being is also just paramount.
There's a conversation happening in a political space with the California Democratic Party. And Pam, you recently appeared on a panel with Superintendent Tony Thurmond and other legislative voices. the conversation that is being led by the Black Caucus within the California Democratic Party is that the platform of California's Democratic Party ought to specifically name as a priority closing achievement gaps for Black students, having funding equity for Black students, supporting the parents and guardians of Black students about choosing whatever public school they want within the public school system. It is some platform language that is about taking what is a race-neutral platform and a platform that mentions other groups, English learners, foster youth, students with special needs, and saying, for all of you that signed the Emmett Till Pledge, for all of you that marched on the front lines and said Black Lives Matter, all of you Democrats, let's get in line and say Black kids matter in education policy. I wonder if you might share some of your thoughts around that.
Is that my question?
Yes, Pam.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank goodness I was taking some notes. But let me reaffirm something that one of my colleagues mentioned, and it's around equity. And that term, everything gets co-opted. Equality got co-opted. Equity is getting co-opted. And again, and we do have to name, we've got to say specifically Black students. We've got to be the advocates that continually put that picture in front of our colleagues. It is indeed, when I took on the role of president of the Board of Governors, we can't be shy about what it is we think and what it is we believe, and that's the power of the position, and to be able to use it. To your question, absolutely, the Democratic Party. I absolutely believe you got to name it before you can deal with it, and you've got to be very explicit about what the values are, and a plan, an actual plan on how you're going to keep the issues around our Black students at the forefront of any discussion that happens. And it's got to spread not just in terms of the elective piece, but in the workforce piece, in the housing piece. There are a number of caucuses in which the African American population and the Black population in California is not being served, in the healthcare piece. So it becomes much bigger than just this political piece, and it's got to be monitored. And I say that because for our California community colleges, we have what is called a Vision for Success, and it is operating in its 5th year, and it has some outcomes that it's been looking at. One of its transfers, but one of the elements is to not only narrow the achievement gap between the terms are used historically underrepresented students, but I'm going to rename it right now for Black students. That achievement, and not only to reduce it, but to eliminate it. And that was 5 years ago. That was profound, because in the educational systems, educators talked about let's narrow it. Nobody ever talked about closing it. So it's aspirational, and our chancellor made certain that, and the Board of Governors approved that. So it's something that we look at annually. It is one, and there are 5 other indicators of what we're trying to do. That is the one sticky goal that is extremely difficult, and which means that we've got to continue to do more, and that's where data comes in, and that's where the will comes in. The real challenge for many of us is, you can make all the rules and regulations and all of the support systems. California is big, and that the role of action is not vested in any one entity, because that happens in every classroom, in every school, and I'm including K-12 in that, in every high school. There's institutional barriers. There's institutional friction to not make that happen in a way that we would like to see it done. And so we've got to continually bring that forward. And again, continually use our data to inform when things are not equitable, when things are not fair, and we got to call it. We got to call it what it is. If we don't do it, then nobody's going to do it.
So I'm going to close our conversation by offering you a rapid fire round, and we're going to do this twice. And I'm gonna lead by modeling and go first. So the first rapid fire round question is, if you could advise Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond on one thing to focus on with this Black Student Achievement Task Force, which he intends to have legislation and influence the conversation and such. And I am a member of the task force, and we've had our first meeting. So what's the one thing you would tell him to do? And I'll start by saying, Superintendent Thurmond, create the body of legislation targeted for Black kids, modeled after what the state of California has done for English learners. Use that as your roadmap about what must be done. All right, who wants to go next?
I'll go. I think, not that I know anything about this person, Dr. Thurmond, or California education, but I would say diversify your teachers. Make sure that you have, more than a proportionate number of Black teachers in classrooms throughout the state.
Thank you, Miriam.
I'll jump in next. I would definitely say to ensure that the curriculum resources and the pedagogy that is outlined in our California state curricular frameworks is such that it's very specific in affirming and celebrating the Black culture, ensuring that people understand that when we are talking specifically about Black students, it doesn't mean that we don't care about every other student group, because that definitely gets mixed up in the mix. So ensuring that there's a clear understanding that when we're talking about what's needed for Black students, we're not trying to forget about all other student groups. We're using that lens of equity and giving every student what they need in the way they need it. Very
good, Cynthia. And Pam.
So this is a hard one, and all of the other ones are. So those are things that I was thinking about. I think that we need to create pipelines for Black students and Black professionals in the educational sphere, and the way we have to do that is change our hiring practices and make certain that we're asking the right questions before we hire, because once you hire, then you've got all of these strictures that make it difficult for change. And so I would be looking at the hiring practices and the encouragement of making certain that our Black university students know that they can come and they're going to be welcomed in our systems.
All right, ladies, one more rapid fire round question. And this is picking up on something that Dr. Glover Woods talked about. She said that she had focus groups with Black students. And just really short as we bring the show to a close, what's one thing you've heard a Black student say that was an aha moment for you?
Well, I will say that, okay, rapid fire. Let me remember that, rapid fire. Okay. I will link it to my last rapid fire response, which is we want to see ourselves in the curriculum. We don't want to show up just at those times when we're talking about the great work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or hearing about Harriet Tubman. They want to see themselves and their culture integrated in all subject areas in a very authentic way.
Love it.
And I would just say that when they do see that, the power that they have the self-advocacy, the confidence, the like, look what I can do, right? It's amazing to see, and it makes your heart, it warms the heart.
Thank you, Miriam. Pam?
The aha moment for me was having students tell me that in 5 years that they had never had a Black teacher.
Poignant. And for me, it was a focus group that happened with our friend, Dr. Charles Cole, with some of our students who said, in response to the question of why does it matter to you to have a Black leader of your school? And they said, I watch how she walks, how she dresses, how she commands a room. I'm watching. Oh my gosh, that gives me chills about what our responsibility is to these young men and women, boys and girls who are watching. This has been Let's Talk Black Education with Dr. Margaret Fortune. My guests today were Dr. Cynthia Glover Woods, a member of the California State Board of Education, Miriam Raccah, the executive director of the Bronx Charter School of the Arts, and the leader of Black in New York City, and Trustee Pam Haynes, who is the president of the Board of Governors for the California Community Colleges. Thank you so much